Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's 2 o'clock, Greenwich Mean Time and also iPhone time. And welcome to today's meeting. We all know each other, so that's the good news. But welcome to today's meeting of the Police and Crime Panel, which is being webcast live to the public. For those not able to watch the footage live, the webcast will be available for viewing on the County Council's website after the meeting. Please can I remind members to switch their microphone on when speaking and to turn it off when they have finished speaking. As a note, the web broadcast crashed, didn't it, at the last meeting after a few minutes? Did it come back on again?
Yeah, it did come back on.
It did come back on. So is there a recording of the full meeting?
Yes, it's all on the
website. All, the whole lot's on the meeting.
Yeah.
Well, that's good news. Moving on, members, we do have apologies from Councillor Elaine Pantlin. Going to the agenda, minutes of the meeting held on the 5th of February, it's pages 3 to 8. I'm going to go through for accuracy only, and I'll be quick as always. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Thank you very much, members. I haven't been advised there's any items that need taken as urgent. Declarations of interest on items on the agenda. Don't seem to be any. No. Thank you very much. Which moves us straight into the meat of the papers today. The Q3 performance report, 1st of October 2019 to the 31st of December 2019. Obviously, you're more than well aware now that, to me, performance papers are second to the budget in most important things. Obviously, it's a very good barometer of the force performance overall. Willie, before I hand over to you, I see Elizabeth is with us, and again, I'll pass our congratulations on to Elizabeth for making this report even more comprehensible to everyone at one grasp. So thanks for all your work, but over to you for the introduction.
Thank you very much for that, Chair. And Lizzie certainly made a big difference since you became performance manager at the OPCC, and I'm very glad that the panel recognise that, and I hope they do in the way in which this is brought before you. But before going on, I must say, otherwise I'll be in trouble. Of course, the Deputy Chief Constable is here, and I'm sure it may well be that there may be the odd question or two for him as well around this paper, and who knows. Okay, so delighted that Rob Nixon's here today. So without more ado, if I may, this is very much Lizzie's paper. I'm going to ask her to talk to the panel. Liz.
Yep, so the paper in front of you is to give an update for the performance for Q3, which is 1st of October to the 31st of October. Before I go into the appendix, which is the actual report, I wanted to spend some time going through the new approach that we've developed which is different to the last report that you might have seen. So if I jump, if it's okay with you, I'll jump to the appendix and to point 1.1. I think it'll be easier to talk through it with one in front of us so it's clear. So 1.1, so this is number of 999 calls. So the measures are now reported against SPC principles, which is Statistic Process Control Chart Principles. And on the charts now, there are 2 grey lines which represent the upper and lower control limits. And in stats, 99.7% of the data should lie between these 2 limits. And they're calculated as plus 3 and minus 3 standard deviations. A standard deviation is the way of measuring how spread out the data is, so it gives us an indication of what normal variance looks like month on month. So they're indicated by the grey lines. The blue line is the actual values per month, and then the red line in the middle is the average values per month as well. So that's what the chart's kind of displaying. The 2 indicators in the next column along, hopefully you've all got colour copies so it's easy to see. So there's the top indicator is the 3.5-year trend, so it's taking into account longer term trends, and the bottom one's a quarterly comparison. And against the 3.5-year trend, there's a different set of indicators that we've kind of locally measuring against. So the first one of which is a single point exception, and that's depicted by a red or green coloured circle. So that tells us if the monthly value has breached the upper or lower control limit, and that normally indicates that is kind of something external causing that performance. For example, upline heart, which we'll see further on in the report. An amber circle is where the data is stable and it's normally around the mean, and that's kind of normal performance. And then the up and down arrows in amber are stable above or below the mean, so that means that it's been a slight step shift above the mean, and it normally is indicated by a change in recording or a change in process. So we can reset the control limits and measure them against a smaller interval. And then a significant increasing or decreasing trend is indicated by a red or green up or down arrow. So that indicates that the trend is significant and prolonged over a period of time. So they're the different measures that we have in the report. The way that we're internally monitoring this now is by exception based only. So we're picking out through the reports things of interest and then raising them at our Strategic Assurance Board in force. The highlights each quarter are picked out and provided in the report, but I'll take us through the reports and pick out some further ones. So just go to the appendix now. Okay. So 1.1, as I kind of explained for the chart before, that shows the number of 999 calls, and that shows that the monthly values are stable, but they are above the mean. So it indicates that we have got a larger than normal number of 999 calls at the moment, but it is stable at that higher level. Moving on to 1.2, 999 calls answer within 10 seconds. So the national target is 90% of calls answer within 10 seconds. At the end of quarter 3, 97.8% of calls in Leicestershire were answered within 10 seconds. So that's good performance there. And that's also been an increase in trend over a period of time, so that's quite good. That's a good one. The next one that I would like to pick out is 1.5, which is 101 calls answered within 30 seconds. So there's no national performance targets against how many calls should be answered, 101 calls should be answered within a certain time. However, we can see a step change over the last 2 months where the significantly increase in performance has been displayed. This is because there's a new software being used in the control room, which enables call handlers to switch between 101 and 999 performance. So that's an increased performance, taking us to 76.1%, where previously it's been under 50. So that's again an increase, and that's also represented in 1.6, which is the abandonment rate, which has dropped to single figures, where previously that's been in double figures. So that's really good performance also. So that's all for the calls, the first section. The next point I wanted to pick out is 2.1 incidents. So this is very stable. However, it does exhibit a really clear seasonal pattern, with an increase over the summer, which is the peaks, and then decreases again over the winter. And you can see that replicating for the last 3 years. The variance of the month-on-month in the seasonal trend, however, is decreasing, so that's why that lump almost isn't as large as it has been previously. So that's an interesting trend, but nothing exceptional. And then 2.2, which is response time by grade. So the grade 1 chart there shows that the blue line has breached the grey line, which is the control limit, in July and August 2018. So this would indicate that there's been some external factors that's caused this exceptional performance. And further analysis has actually been undertaken, and that's the reasons behind this is the 2018 World Cup, which saw a large demand come to the fore, so the response time was obviously impacted. So that's understood now, so we know that reason, and we can put a historical marker on for that. So if there's ever a World Cup again, we know that that might have an impact on our performance in this way. Everything else on the incidents is fairly stable around the mean. This is some seasonal patterns exhibited in ASB incidents, as we'd expect to kind of peak over the summer, but it's all stable around the mean and nothing is exceptional and breaching any kind of limits that we've set. So moving on to crime. So measure 3.1, all crime. So this is extremely stable around the mean. So it's slightly above the mean, but it's around 7,000 crimes recorded each year. And there has been a really significant, well, not significant, but there's been a clear step shift since April 2018, which is kind of due to crime recording and an increase in crime recording. But that's remained really stable throughout for the last periods. 3.3 is the next one. So as kind of documented in the report, violence with injury offences has, so the blue line has breached the grey control limit, which indicates that there's kind of external factors driving this variation. At the Assurance Board, further analysis was requested by the Commissioner, and this is being undertaken currently, and a full report will be provided to the panel in the next report, so with the explanations of why that has breached that. I don't know whether you wanted to add any extra context.
Do you want me to come in ad hoc? Is that the easiest way of doing it, Chair? I think it's really interesting because when people see that, we think we've got Armageddon happening on the streets, and actually already our analysis is showing that of the violence with injury, there's 2,400 offences within that category. 2,168 of them relate to ABH, so it's not the serious high end that people often associate with violence with injury, and actually 38% of all of that actually relates to domestic violence. So it's really interesting when you start to break down. So effectively what we're seeing is within violence with injury, 38% is domestic related, which is good because it's being reported and we're obviously responding to that. There is a chunk which is relating to nighttime economy, and because of some of the changes in nighttime economy, where historically you might have one incident recorded, you might now have multiple victims in one incident. So that is also impacting on violent crime figures. And then outside of that, and the bit that I think a lot of people are really concerned about, is your gang, OCG, knife-related type crime, of which actually equates to about 7%. So the 7% of what a lot of being spoken about in the media, when you actually get underneath that, that's a really small fraction of what some of this violence relates to. And if I was just to give you a bit of a headline figure, the third highest category within violence with injury is actually dog bites. So read into that what you will. So the 62 incidents are recorded within Q3 that relate to injuries that have been caused by people that haven't got their dog under control. So it's such a wide basket, but I thought I'd give you some context.
So picking out 3.4 next, violence without injury offences. So I thought it might be useful to clarify the offence types that are in the violence with and without categories. As Rob just said, they're really vast in them, so I thought it'd be quite good to clarify. So violence without injury offences are threats to kill, and then all the assaults without injury, which can be separated into common assault and battery. So common assault is a threat of immediate violence, and battery is touching without consent, without injury. And the borderline between it being recorded as a battery offence to a violence with injury is just that with injury and without injury. So it's quite a split between the two, but one will go into violence with and one will go into violence without. And the with injury part of the assault with injury could be down to stress, psychological or physical injury caused on the victim. So they're the kind of definitions of violence with injury. But violence without injury is relatively stable, although above the mean, but it has been stable since April 18. Yeah. So moving on to 3.5, which is knife offences. Again, I thought it'd be useful to detail which crime types are included in this category. So this is as per the annual data return to the Home Office, and includes categories as attempted murder, threats to kill, ABH and GBH, which are both in the violence with injury category, robbery, rape and sexual assault, and these offences are anything where a knife's been seen, threatened or used. We've recently in our office just done a dip sample of the Q2 offences, so we won't relate to this data seen in front of you, but the quarter before, and approximately 64% of these offences in this category as no injury's been recorded. So, and 64% of the offences were where the knife was threatened rather than used. So they make up a large chunk of that category. Everything else on this page looks fairly stable, so I'll move on. The next one I wanted to pick out was 3.9, which is drug offences. So on this chart here, the blue line has breached the upper limit, and that's in May 2019, and this can be attributed to the proactive activity undertaken through Op Lionheart, where a lot of offences were recorded as a subsequent of the proactive activity by the police. So that explains that deviation. Yeah. Moving on to section 4, which is outcomes. So 4.1, volume of positive outcomes. Again, we can see the blue line breaches the control limit in May 2019, again attributed to Op Lionheart. Because that was proactive activity by the police, a lot of positive outcomes were recorded throughout that activity. So that peak in offences also saw a peak in outcomes, which can be seen on that chart there. I think, and everything else looks stable. Nothing else I want to pick out from that. So moving on to section 5, which is prevention. So looking at measures 5.1 to 5.3, which are all relating to stop and search. So the top chart shows the number of stop and searches carried out per monthly values, and we can see that blue line increasing towards the upper control limit. So at the moment we've coloured that as green and positive activity, purely because the outcomes and arrests are also increasing. So it suggests that we're doing more activity, also arresting more people, and also getting the positive outcomes for that work that we're doing, that the Leicestershire Police are doing. And that's kind of all the measures I wanted to pick out. I'm happy to take questions on any.
Happy to answer questions.
Okay, well, thank you very
Listen
much.
to what the panel has to say about these figures.
Yeah, and thanks again, Elizabeth, for making it more user-friendly, I think the phrase is, isn't it? Certainly a big improvement to what it was a few years ago. Yeah, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the main agenda paper and then we'll move on to each section. We do have one question. I'm not quite sure where the question wants to come in, but if we go on to page 9, I will take the section. I'll be quick as always. Background, highlights. Ivan. Ivan, can you press your doodah?
Not come on. No, it has now. Right. The standard deviation usually has a figure associated with it, and that's not included in this report. So with an IQ test, if you ended up with a score of 70, it would be somewhere within the range of 86 down to 54. 3 standard deviations implies a much wider range, and I just wonder, what is the standard deviation numerical figure?
Yeah, so the standard deviation limit plus or 3 minus has been calculated for each of the different crime types. So for each measure independently, it's been calculated for each different. So each different measure reported has got its own calculation for standard deviation, and the range is the top and bottom grey lines, and the figures, although small, the figures are on there, but we could do a plus or minus. Some other statistical process control charts have the 1, 2, 3 bands on there for the different ranges. We've just got 3 because it includes most of the data, so 99% should be within these 2 limits. But if you kind of change those down to the different levels of +1 or +1 or +2, that gets a bit narrower. But that's something we could look to do in the future once we know that the performance is stable.
For my education, does that mean that each 3.3, 3.4, 3.5 has got a different interpretation of a standard deviation?
It's the same calculation that's used to calculate it, but they'll be relevant to that specific crime type. So it'll be, their standard deviation will be...
Percentage of numbers.
It's numbers, yeah.
Yeah, I'm struggling here because I'm used to having a standard deviation which has a numerical factor attached to it. And if you're telling me that all of these sections have a different standard deviation, then I think that needs to be identified. Otherwise, quite frankly, you can interpret this in the wrong way.
So the 3 standard deviations is the same across all. So each measure's got 3 standard deviations applied to it, but the 3 standard deviations are calculated using the variance of the points that have been across that whole period, so that it's relevant to each chart. So if we took the variance for 999 calls, which is on average 12,000 a month, and applied that 3 standard deviation limit to crimes where there's 7,000 a month, those control limits wouldn't necessarily be relevant to those numbers. So they have been calculated in exactly the same way, but they're just tailored to each different crime type and the numbers recorded per month. So we know that when we look at all crime, the variance between each month and month, the control limits are relevant to that crime category.
Thanks for the question, Ivan. Les.
Thank you, Chair. I think having a visual dashboard is hugely useful. Nothing speaks louder than visual dashboarding. What I have concerns with is, firstly, and I think my learned colleague and I may be coming from the same direction here, standard deviation is only relevant if you understand statistical analysis. Okay? I happen to be trained in statistical analysis. I'm assuming Ivan has some element of training in statistical analysis. You clearly are. It needs to be put in English. That's number one. Where I think we have a greater opportunity, if I may, moving average trend lines are far superior to peaks and trough lines. Far superior, because it sets out very clearly and very visually the overall trend of direction. Irrefutable, over time, no peaks, no troughs, and actually, if you put map lines through an awful lot of these graphs, actually you'll find they're going up over time, on average, okay? And that's the more important factor. Not that it's, and I don't wish to be rude or cheeky or anything offensive, the chart suggests more monthly variation when compared to the response time to grade 1 incidents. We need to put this into English. This is a public document, and only people who understand statistical analysis are going to be able to understand some of the context. But I think the great opportunity is A, stick the moving average trend line in, but B, and actually you've done some of it in your narrative, and I've seen your little post-it notes there. You've actually put the substantive reasoning in your feedback. The substantive reasoning needs to be in here, that sets out why this effect is happening, what you think. Is it because something the police force have done? Is it something that the World Cup is an example? Because that's how we will be able to form our questions as to cause and effect. So for me, jump out of the statistical phraseology and terminology, move it into English, and put the substantive reasoning in as to why those effects have taken place. That would make, I think, for the lay person, a lot easier to understand. So I'm not being rude, I'm not being offensive. I think having a dashboarding system, presumably this is Power BI, is hugely, hugely useful, both to us as committee members, to members of the public. It's in your face, it's visual, you can see it. But if you put the substantive explanations in to this report, rather than the statistical nuance and all the rest of that, actually it'll make it a lot easier for people to understand and interpret, and actually then form the questions for the panel. Thank you, Chair.
I think it's a really good observation. I think I'd just go back to Liz's, because obviously this has been developed for the PCC to hold the force to account, and I think the first thing you said was the intention is that this starts as an indicator to then ask the force to come and present at the Strategic Assurance Board the deep dive. I think if the chronology is right, what will happen is that'll flag it up, we'll have that conversation, whatever gets discussed there then naturally gets choreographed to come into here, which is obviously in the public place. So I actually think it's a really positive step forward. I think the trend line's a really good observation, and you're astute enough to pick up the Power BI is sitting underneath this, so there's a lot of information that is available, but I sense that the journey, the direction of travel is, this is the first, what do we need to have a look at, deep dive, come, scrutinise it, have a look at it, and then be able to come and present in a far more in-depth way here. So I think the direction of travel is the right one.
I totally agree, and I made the note, the 2018 World Cup. Actually, if it had been in the narrative, we wouldn't even need to ask the question. We go, oh yeah, that's what it was. Yeah. Thank you, Chair.
Sorry, I run the risk of labouring points, but the World Cup's a really interesting one because we might see an increase in demand, but the other pressure point that the force has, you see, is that we will get requested for staffing. So you've got an increased demand locally and mutual aid nationally. So you've got this tipping point of you've got less staff because they're going down to London or wherever, but at the same time the pubs, the clubs are all celebrating, so you have a local increase. So it is that context.
Paul.
Yeah, I can't pretend to understand whatever it was trend analysis, and I'm certainly not a statistical. I can't even say it. The journey that we've been on is one of, fundamentally picking out what matters, and what this has been great on doing is being able to sort of look at it instead of having a kind of great big tome which we began with. We've got a thing that you can look at, visualize, see clearly, and pick out the things that matter. And there are two bits that really matter, and that's been a fantastic step forward for us, being able to spot what matters and then focus our energies on those things. So the conversation about the trend thing, we will certainly take forward. This, in terms of a step forward, it's been great.
I support you here, Paul. I mean, when I think where we were, not that long ago, certainly just before Elizabeth came, it was nothing like this whatsoever. Massive improvement. And all it's done is obviously supplied the information, seen what's important, and created debate on how to improve further. So that has to be good. I will take Deborah and then back to you then, Les.
Thank you. I'm with Paul. I won't pretend to understand any of this either.
We can offer some help.
That's why I came this side, just so you can help me. Yeah.
I'll bring the book next time.
And I think I agree with it. It's a lot better than what we had before. So we're definitely going in the right direction. And we'll tweak it as we need to. My question is just about how we compare with other forces or within our family group. There's nothing in there that gives me any indication to tell me how Leicestershire's performing nationally or in our family group.
I think there's a problem about the family group at the moment. It's slightly out of date, old-fashioned, the ones that we're associated with. That has needed to be looked at for a while, I think. Some are obviously still in our family group, others aren't, but it's a very good point. Could I, while I've just got the floor for a second, point out that in paragraph 3 of the report on page 9, this report is work in progress. I think that's really important to remember, and will be developed further by Lizzie in consultation with the police, but also that's why it's so useful to be able to bring it to the panel, who can also express their views. So this isn't the final article. Sorry,
Again, support you, Les.
It's just an add-on comment, really, and I think the power of performance data is ultimately how you correlate that information with cause and effect. And what would be really, really useful, and it was kind of mentioned earlier on 3.3, the ABH, that moving average trend is clearly going up quite significantly. 2,168 were ABH. Yeah. Actually, that's the kind of stuff we need to know, not this noise in the document. But equally, does it correlate with something else that's going on in the system and in the mechanism? Because that, as we have a number of committees and agencies that all interlink here and hook together, particularly CSP I'm thinking of. And actually understanding those underlying correlations actually is what will allow us to get to where we need to get to, which is earlier identification, earlier indication, early prevention. So I think it's a brilliant report. I really like visual dashboards. I think they're hugely, and I think this has only come to life since we met in Melton 6 weeks ago or something like that, really, I think, yeah. So, huge progress, but boy, can we make this so much better. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, I don't think you got any further comment on that at all, or am I wrong?
Only to say something, maybe that Rob will want to say something as well. Well, I mean, one of the trends you should look for isn't necessarily societal or anything like that. It can just be recording crime, reporting crime and then recording crime. And the force has made a real effort after what wasn't a great report in 2017 to improve its recording of crime. I wish I could say all forces have done the same. They haven't.
Not labouring the point. Actually, the ABH is a really good example of that, because we are seeing an increase in that ABH relating to incidents get recorded. So they're coming in via an incident, and we're picking them up quicker and recording them. Historically, they were getting recorded as a common assault, which is an injury without injury, so it was falling in that violence without injury category. Now it's going into the with injury. So a lot of our tightening up of recording is having an impact, for sure.
Okay, thanks very much. So Les's suggestions will be taken back and looked at. Yep, thanks very much. Yep, thank you. Thank you, Ivan. Still on page 9, we haven't got very far yet, have we? Highlights. Les was one who said he wanted to go at 4:45, but
Performance and statistics was my favourite areas. Guest.
page 10, page 10, Q3 performance. Now, moving on to the appendices, obviously we can hop around, but it would be nice to keep in sections, and there aren't that many sections. Calls. 2 is incidents. Debbie?
Thank you. Just 2.4, the peaks and troughs there. Maybe I'm reading this graph totally wrong. I'm sure you'll tell me if I am. But do we have an incident of more people going missing in fine weather than we do people going missing in the winter? Is that what happens, as from what I read from this chart?
That's what you could.
In the summer, I would say there is a greater prevalence of perhaps people that are in looked after establishment, and younger people go missing because they're into a lifestyle choice at that time of year. Obviously, when you're getting into some of the winter months, you tend to get more, I would say, anecdotally, an increase in those that are perhaps suffering from depression, mental health, and are more prone towards a suicide. So don't hold me to it, but if you were to ask me to draw on my policing experience, I'd say you'll see more activity around young people in the summer, probably a little bit more around mental health, depression, suicide in the winter.
Just on 3.11, where it's got CSE, are we still having this as CSE, or are we having it as CCE? Because there's no mention of CCE in any of the performance.
Yeah, that's CSE, but you're absolutely right, because obviously at the moment we've just brought together the CSE, modern day slavery, and the wider CCE around wider exploitation. So that's a really good observation in terms of refining that down so that we're clear on that.
So the other side,
You're doing grand, there you go, go on.
4.7, I'm not sure what that tells me. Should I be concerned? Because I can't anything from that at all.
I mean, that is data which was a benchmark from the random speculative, what was the old crime survey. It was 700 people were surveyed, and that's what they came up with as a figure. It's interesting, the analysis that we've done on it tends to suggest that there was, or for what data we could get our hands on, we've identified some groups that we think there might be some lower levels of confidence and satisfaction, and what we've started to do now is put in place a confidence recovery plan, which is all around some really old-fashioned basics. You said, we did, communicating closer with some of those disaffected or groups that are less confident. And also I think some of the new target operating model may impact on that, because what we know from confidence, it's either you said, we did is a big indicator. The second bit is, once you've come into contact with us, did you get a good service? And what we know is that in the current operating model, there was too many handoffs, and that was leading to a decline in service and satisfaction levels. The new target operating model, which goes live on the 11th of March, officers will have clear ownership from day one. So we think that that will increase confidence and a better service for those victims. So it feels like that's a moment in time. The world has moved on.
You just mentioned certain groups. So what groups do you think are lacking confidence?
Well, bearing in mind, we had to look at what their data was. Their data tended to suggest that people that were predominantly, I would say, working class, probably unemployed, probably living on certain parts of the west side of the city, were in particular a group that felt lower levels of confidence. Now, again, there might be, depending on who they asked, it might be that, you know, on one day they're a victim, on one day they're an offender. Discuss how does that impact on confidence. But the reality is, it's a very, very small sample size. It's not even statistically significant to get, for those that get it turned on by stats. No, so it's not even statistically significant, but that said, it would be remiss if we didn't look at it. So we've looked at it. The other ones that and it didn't come out from this data, the other areas that we're looking at in terms of where we think there's likely to be lower confidence is from underrepresented groups, and clearly that's a really important area for us, particularly given the diversity of Leicester and Leicestershire. So, okay.
Thank you very much, members. Prevention at number 5, we have He-Man.
Yes, thank you, Chair. 5.1 to 5.3, of course, it reflects the stop and search seems to be having positive outcomes. But if you look at section 5.1, where it says there has been series of points, 16 months data, where the volume of stop search has been above the mean value, this suggests some prolonged bias exists. And for better statistical monitoring, it is recommended that the control limits are reset. What does that actually mean? Do you extend the standard deviation so that the more stop and search can be accommodated?
What it means is that if you, from when we've had the drive and increase in stop and search, if we reset the control limits, what will happen actually is that it's more likely that they'll close up on the more recent data because there's less variance month on month. I think that's been some of a recommendation and quite a lot of the charts to reset them, particularly since like April 2018 when we had the change in recording practices, because it's a lot more stable since then. So what tends to happen is if you reset them, they often become tighter around the actual value.
So they will run closer to the mean, basically. Then.
Yeah. So it would basically just they'll probably all jump up a little bit, and then be tighter, so we can monitor it more closely.
Thank you.
And it's really just jumping back to the earlier points and observations. Is the section 5 is all about prevention. This is increased police activity to stop and search. Media doesn't always look favourable on that. The question is, what effect has that increase in stop and search had elsewhere within the crime figures? So, you know, for every positive outcome, whatever that definition is, somewhere one would expect to see something has not happened, be it a drug crime or a knife crime or whatever. So it's about that correlating data and information that just says, okay, you've increased all this proactive approach to crime prevention. Where do we see the effect? What's actually the opposite side of that coin, which is what's reducing, or what hasn't increased as much as it would have? So it's just an observation, Chair. Not necessarily need to comment on, but
I got Paul, and then I think Rob. Yeah.
I mean, so Lizzie and I have discussed this, and you're dead right. I mean, so the prevention bit needs more work on, and insofar as there are two elements that we're looking at the moment. You know, separately, you've had inputs on the public health approach that we're adopting and the way in which we've used public health data more effectively and looking at impact on the risk indicators that are kept within that. That's one avenue that we've looked at. Another that we have been exploring is the possibility, in fact, we've brought a paper here on the nighttime economy, some time ago, if you remember. And in looking at that, what we looked at was the trajectory before and after. So we plotted the trajectory of nighttime economy offences, and we looked at what interventions took place and when they took place, and then looked at the subsequent trajectory. Now, there are, I'm sure statistically you could do an awful lot of damage to that, Les, as a methodology, or Ivan. But I don't think the analysis is that well developed in terms of prevention at the moment. But that's the sort of areas that we're looking at, and we would certainly be, we'd be interested in ideas that you have to offer and recognise your point. Yeah.
Anything else on that section? Okay, I think you've all had ample opportunity to discuss the report. Elizabeth, once again, thank you very much. You've taken performance reports a long, long way. It is ongoing, we all know that. Thanks to members of the panel for their suggestions, and we look forward to further improvement. Members, I ask you all to note the report. Okay, thanks very much. Moving on to agenda item 6, the HMIC FRS thematic inspection, both sides of the coin. Would you like to introduce Lord Barr?
Very, very briefly, this document, I think the panel wanted some more information on. We think it's useful to bring to the panel. It was a thematic inspection, which meant it didn't sort of concentrate on the good and bad of each police force, but it certainly had some interesting conclusions. I'm going to ask Angela if she will, just to briefly introduce it and then pass on to Paul.
Well, once Angela's finished, I may not have much more to say.
Angela, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I'll just briefly go through some aspects of the report, Chair. So, as the Commissioner has explained, it was a thematic inspection. The inspection itself really concentrated on the analysis of data and documents provided to the inspectors. They did visit external agencies like the National Crime Agency, and they did visit 10 police forces. Leicestershire were not one of those forces, and Leicestershire were not mentioned in this report. The report itself came out with 10 recommendations, 4 of which were the Home Office, 2 for the College of Policing, 2 for the National Crime Agency, and 1 each for the Department of Education and National County Lines Coordination Centre. There are aspects of the report that cover the force approach. I'll leave the Deputy Chief Constable who may wish to speak to that. But regarding the Commissioner holding the force to account, the Chief Constable to account, he does have regular reports to his Strategic Assurance Board. He attends the force strategic performance meetings. He has one-to-one weekly meetings with the Chief Constable, and he is also briefed on specific operations that are likely to take place. An example of that is Operation Lionheart, where the Commissioner was briefed before the operation commenced, and that was through a confidential briefing. The only other thing that I would want to say, I think, and I know the Commissioner can speak for himself, but there is assurance provided regularly on how the force approach county lines, and there's confidence in the approach that is taken. I won't add any more, but the Deputy Chief Constable might wish to talk about the force response. Or Paul.
Sorry, I'll retract my previous withdrawal from this. I mean, the bit I thought was interesting, though, was the section. I mean, it is quite about technical developments and sort of infrastructure arrangements, but the bit I was particularly interested was the bit about CCE, and you mentioned that earlier, Deborah. I mean, I think that's the story where Rob may want to say more about that. Well, we've got a good case to present, the way in which that's happening in an interagency way, the development of the exploitation team that Rob has led on, and the way in which multi-agency partnerships are working well in that area. That's really the only bit that's kind of non-technical, if you like, about within the recommendations. We've separately, Lord Bark and I have met with John Sinnott and Jane Moore in relation to the issue about children being moved from care home to care home across area and the impact that has, and that does seem to be a serious issue. It's really quite heartening to see that being picked up in here. But that was the only bit I'd want to sort of highlight from the report.
Okay, Chair. I mean, I know we've talked about serious and organised crime here before. So, but just a quick recap, we wanted to be ahead of the curve on this, so we started to pick up what was going on. So certainly 2 years ago, we reconfigured. So internally, we've got our own serious and organised crime board, and as a consequence of that, we have also got a covert element that we run all the time. In terms of looking at opportunities, we also look at the strategy right the way from prevention right the way through to pursue. We've set up a dedicated SOC pursue team that constantly work from one serious and organised crime group to another, looking at disruption and dismantling. The other bit that I would like to give the panel assurance on is that we routinely have a significant chunk of the East Midlands, so EMSU, East Midlands Special Operations Unit, clearly they have some capabilities, and we make sure that we definitely get value for money on that. So in terms of SOC for the last couple of years has been a forced priority, because my sense is if you're not on top of your serious and organised criminals and you're not on top of your networks, very quickly it can run away with you. So hence it was always one that we built capability, built specialist sort of techniques and officers that can deal with it, and routinely we are running operations, and that goes right the way through. So the impact of doing the operations on this type of injury is having a knock-on on sort of firearms deployments. We're doing far more of those because we are actively targeting and disrupting serious and organised crime.
What I'm going to do, members, with this, we'll just take the main paper, which is the agenda item 6, and we'll go through section by section, but then when we come to the appendix or report on page 37, we'll just throw it wide open to questions. But on the report on page 33, any questions on background? Page 34, false position. Police intelligence prioritisation. Oh, sorry. Which one first? Late.
I don't know what section. Mine's on top of page 35. I don't know if that's the same number.
Have you been looking at my...
No, I think you've been looking at mine. I've got a real concern. I love this paper. This was like joy to me to read this and the recommendations in there. Mine's about the knock-on effects of Operation Lionheart and the figures there, because obviously we're now getting people released that have served their sentence, and there's a real issue within the community about people coming back out and just picking up where they left on. So I've not seen anything in here that gives me confidence and that we're supporting those communities. So I think the operation was brilliant, what we did was brilliant, but we are now back to square one if we're not careful, and I need to see some more action around that.
Can I give you some assurance that actually it's not over, and the reality is these things you have to look at it in the round. So Paul might want to add, we've been having discussions around the whole offender management. So actually the engagement that happens whilst they're in prison, and then when they come out, and what that looks like from a multi-agency perspective. But certainly from my perspective is they will be right on the radar when they come out, and they're either going to comply, and if they don't comply then we're into control and we'll be back into targeting them fairly quickly. So they've certainly not gone off our radar.
I think it's more the community. Community are worrying, and we need to do some more work with the community to reassure them that that is happening, because that message is not out there.
Thank you, Chair. Top of page 35. I'm just curious if anybody can remember the number of weapons and firearms recovered is missing. It's the actual physical number. Does anybody know off the top of their head what it was?
Yes.
Would the Deputy Chief Constable like to impart that information?
We recovered a number of 2 or 3. What I would say is Section 5. We recovered a shotgun. But then, if you're into sort of bladed weapons, air weapons, there was more than that. So again, it's defined weapon. So when I'm thinking, what were the high end of this? We're talking about shotguns. Yes, we recovered some shotguns, but we also recovered a load of long-barreled air weapons, which actually are legal, but they can be used for illegal purposes. So I think the good thing from here is where it talks about a firearm, it was a legitimate shotgun that we recovered from an organised crime group that had actually been stolen from a burglary.
We're not going to get a number, but that's fine.
Okay, just for my own help, page 34, police intelligence prioritisation and response, which takes you over to 35, which then takes you on to joint working with other public services. Ivan?
Well, the reason I'm coming in is the fact that in paragraph 20, it talks about the PCC funding the strategic lead for child criminal exploitation, which I would totally support. But what I don't know is how effective that work is. Are there any local areas that could be smoothed out? So when can we expect a report on the outcomes of setting up this post?
So from an operational perspective, this was we put a detective inspector to look at the bringing together of exploitation, modern day slavery and criminal exploitation through what is the vulnerability executive, and I know that people from the safeguarding boards are linked into that. They were looking at what the criminal justice process would look like. So rather than just put people in the system and then criminalise them straight away, it was a case of, are they an offender or are they being exploited? And they've designed a process which flushes that out, and that the agencies are starting to work together. I certainly know from a police perspective, we have now started to move to migrating the unit into one, so we've got greater resilience. And I know that Superintendent Matt Ditcher is linked in with both safeguarding leads for both city and county. The process, I think, has been fairly well adopted, and I suspect that there's ongoing discussions about how that then becomes mainstream business within other agencies. But in terms of a report, that work is definitely ongoing, and I would imagine that it's been discussed within, or I would hope it's been discussed within the safeguarding boards, of which I know, Ivan, you're driving the city side, aren't you? So,
County side would be the one that
yes.
I'd be driving, and Matt Ditcher is on the Children's Partnership. We've got all of these executive boards, groups that meet. This is a public forum, and as far as the public are concerned, there's actually no information as to how effective this is. You may know that in your meetings, but I think the risk is you assume that we know it. My equivalent in the city, Sarah Russell, and myself work not to a local job description, but to a national statutory job description. And it's quite possible for us to be missed out in terms of information. We know that the arrangement over at Wigston over child sexual exploitation that involves the NHS, the councils and yourselves is very effective. According to the Chief Constable, it's cutting edge for England. It would be really nice to know whether this strategic lead is in the same category.
If I could just interject here, could we have a report on this next time?
I think, yeah, I mean, it's a question of when this is only just effectively it's still being set up. I don't want a report to be brought too soon, which doesn't tell you enough. What I would like to suggest, though, if it's possible, and it's really, perhaps it's for Rob to do, but is to invite the panel. You know, the panel have visited the police headquarters a number of occasions, but to go to the hub at Wigston, to be shown round it, to see the work that's actually being done. I know that's not answering Ivan's question. I would have thought you'd want to see that hub, and then in a couple of meetings' time, probably get a report on how this is going. But I think a report too soon is really before it's had a chance to get together. But the hub is worth seeing, I have to say.
I'm looking around for
great
members.
enthusiasm, but,
Sorry, Rob, can I get him?
No, I'd welcome anybody to come and have a look at it. I go back to what they were asked to do. What they've been asked to do is just to work with partners and design an operational process which picks up the individuals, shares the information and makes sure it's an appropriate response. That they're not forced down a criminal justice process. They're looking at it from a safeguarding perspective and sharing info at the first part rather than waiting till it's gone through the criminal justice process. So partly this was about process re-engineering and looking at what the caseload would look like for other agencies from a safeguarding perspective to respond to. And I certainly know that there's some really good practice. What we need to do is perhaps choreograph that as to when to bring that back, because it still is very early days.
I think I will accept it's early days, but would you be happy to bring, in 2 meetings' time, to bring a report?
It won't be me in 2 meetings' time. It will be my successor. I just want to make sure that the foundations are there and in place, because when we move on to the inspection report that accompanies this particular paper, there are some very disturbing comments in there that, as a police and crime panel, I don't think we can afford to ignore. And I'll come back to those in due course with your agreement.
Yep, of course, Byron. We'll take your, if Ewan could liaise with your office then for a visit for the hub, and then for a report at the earliest opportunity, shall we say, following the experience. Yeah. Thanks very much, members. Still on page 35, powers and legislation, which brings us to the end of the main report, but it does open up the appendix, which is a lot thicker, and obviously you're more than welcome to fire in any questions or clarification points anywhere in the report, because it would take too long to go paragraph by paragraph. Evan?
I'll take you a general invitation up, if I may. I'm looking at page 42.
42.
And I'm looking probably 4/5 of the way down to the paragraph headed information needs to be shared. And it says, for example, local authorities don't always tell the police when they move at-risk children into their areas. And then I link that to the comment about the Department for Education in the recommendations. And I get disturbed at that point, Chair, because I personally raised with other lead members, the then Minister, Edward Timpson, drew his attention to the fact that we had authorities placing children in Leicestershire and we didn't know about it. We were learning by default. The pat answer that I got back was, well, this is against procedures. Of course it's against procedures, but who's actually monitoring the effectiveness of the procedures? This has got nothing to do with the police, nothing to do with the Police and Crime Commissioner. It's to do with effective Department for Education monitoring. And the fact that they don't take it seriously leads to all sorts of subsequent issues. So I was not surprised to find a reference to the DFE in here, and I thought it would be wrong, because I raised this with Edward Timpson. It's got to be 3 to 4 years ago, and I thought maybe I'm the odd one out. But when all the other hands went up from other lead members in England around the table, I realised I wasn't the odd one out, and it was a peculiarity often of county areas where other councils bought foster parent places and moved children in, not necessarily always telling us. So I just say that I've read this. I think it's a very good report. I think there are some issues in here that will need to be addressed locally, but overall, how we get through to the Department for Education, their responsibility, I just don't know, because they are the people who've got the power at their elbow to say to local authorities, you must, and if you don't, this will be the outcome.
Paul, you mentioned you had a meeting with the Chief Exec and Jane earlier. Is there any help or clarification on this you can give us?
Well, it's probably best for Lord Back to respond. Yeah, he raised it, and then Lord Back. So John and Jane met with us to raise the issue, exactly as Ivan says, and with a view to Lord Back raising a question in the House of Lords.
Well, I meet with Ivan regularly, and we often is a subject on our agenda, which Ivan refers to. Jane Moore and Johnson wanted me to ask a question, a written question in the Lords. This is some time ago now, must be 18 months ago or so, on this issue of the number of children from outside Leicestershire who end up in Leicestershire's homes. And the answer from the department, I'm trying to think which department it was, and I think it must have been the DFE, gave what is a kind of classic holding answer. So maybe this is an issue that needs pursuing, because it's still obviously a really live issue as far as Leicestershire is concerned. Probably more Leicestershire than quite a number of other counties, I think.
Thank you. Just to come back and to bring in another role that I hold, if I may, Chair, with your agreement, that of the Chair of the Regional Migration Board. We are aware of the fact that it is commonplace for authorities to have to locate children in their care outside their area. So that's accepted. It's accepted practice, particularly with unaccompanied asylum-seeking children who want to gravitate towards an area where there are other people from their ethnic and cultural background. The rub here is ineffective monitoring by the DFE to make sure the system works 100%. And it could be that in your capacity you might want to consider writing to Edward Timpson, the Minister, to draw his attention to the comments that have been made today and to ask what's being done to make sure it's rectified. That would back up Lord Bark's question, and it would back up other questions.
Rob, did you have your finger up at all? On, no. It's Kirk, was it? Okay.
To add to Ivan's point, this is something that's been raised nationally by PCCs and a joint piece of work we've been looking at with West Mids I was going to mention later on. But there's been some discussion around proposals or a recommendation to have a national register of looked after children and those that are moving around different places. And it's possibly something we could look at wearing different hats across LLR as a pilot to something that we could then use as an example back to the DFE to say, we're doing it here, you know, we do it as best as we can, but there still needs some legislation and policy nationally around this to try and take away some of the loopholes and the grey areas that exist within it.
Yeah, thanks for that, Kirk. Is there any other points on this, Debbie? Okay, I'll look at putting a letter together, Ivan, and with Ewan's help and guidance, and we'll ping it off to the Minister. Yeah.
That shouldn't be left as a suggestion. That actually needs to be formally implemented.
I've got a few points. Do you want me to do them all in one go? Yes. Okay. All the way through this report, there's a lot about information sharing that's mentioned. So that's really concerning that the information and data's there, but we're not sharing it. So that's something that I'd like to ensure we looked into. Also on page 42 at the bottom about different definitions. So have we got the same risk matrix that's used across the board in Leicestershire and all the CSPs and things like that? Are we all singing from the same hymn sheet for risk or not? So that's another question I'd like looked into. Really pleased to see that modern slavery, I think through Operation Lionheart we had quite a few that were prosecuted for modern slavery, which gives us a bit more control of them when they come out, so really pleased to see that. The one point is on page 56, the single law enforcement system. Just the third paragraph down about the impact of county lines and importing of areas and things like that. I mean, I'd just be interested to know what's happening in Charnwood and across Leicestershire regarding that. That's it, Chair. Thank you.
Yeah, in terms of when you say what is happening around county lines, there's some bits that I am prepared to talk about and there's some bits I'm not, for obvious reasons, but I'll gladly talk to you outside. But in terms of going back to the SOC, so our serious and organised crime capability is now constantly working on dismantling of organised crime networks. And if I was to say to you, in terms of threat areas, clearly we've done quite a long operation on Charnwood. You know that I oversaw Operation Lionheart. We are continuing to monitor what that market looks like, because the last thing you do is do an operation, withdraw, and then because invariably you create a vacuum and that can lead to all sorts of issues. So there is constant monitoring activity that will go on around the Charnwood, and we are routinely identifying where people come up. But rather than wait, we're looking for quick intervention options to take people out. And what I would suggest is more than happy to have a chat, Deborah, outside and just talk that through and make sure that Mark is suitably briefed in. Obviously, anything that's taking place around enforcement or in the overt space, I'm more than happy to talk about. Anything else, I can't talk about.
Can I just make a point about the modern slavery point that you make? I mean, I think everyone really knows that the most effective way of dealing with those who are the perpetrators, the main perpetrators in county lines, is, if it's possible to do so, to prosecute them for modern slavery. Because that's what they don't want to. If it's just merely another drugs offence on there, it doesn't matter so much whatever the sentence is. But for modern slavery, that is not something anyone wants to be convicted of, because I dare say it doesn't go down very well if you end up in prison. And the classic case, and I think I have referred to it before, is the one which doesn't affect Leicestershire, but it affected Birmingham and Lincolnshire, where the perpetrator, the puppet master, the one who was running everything, was only a young man in Birmingham who ran these disaffected kids, and disaffected is a nice word for it. I mean, they'd left home, they really had nowhere to go, and he put them up in digs in Lincoln, and they had to go back between Lincoln and Birmingham all the time, carrying drugs, doing that mule stuff. And when he eventually came to be sentenced for modern slavery, as I understand it, he got 14 years at a very, very young age. It seemed to me that was a really good piece of the court doing the CPS and the court doing their job.
Just the one point about the risk matrix at the bottom of page 42, because that really is a difficulty for us in our community safety partnerships. 42 at the bottom, different definitions of child, because that does cause a huge amount of problems in our community safety partnerships, with the boroughs having one risk, adult social caring, and other school children social caring are different, and those risk thresholds change and they don't follow. So is there something we can do looking around to get everyone from the same risk matrix?
I can try and answer that without having an answer. But I think that the DFE and policing have some responsibility around that. But you'll come in a safeguarding category at the end of the day, because you're talking about children being exploited criminally. So it will probably fall into a definition around safeguarding, I'm sure. And then it's how the other agencies agree at a local level to take on one adopted definition of what that looks like around this. So it's probably building on what Ivan was talking about earlier around using the CCE stuff, what that project and project manager is going to be scoping out, and how that programme will look going forward, alongside incorporating other things like lack children and so on and so on. But I think you can define it locally. It's just having one lead person to say that's what we're going to do, and we all sign up to it, which I think, to be fair, the CCE team, I'd expect them to take that up.
And that was seamless, because that's exactly the work the post we were talking about is doing or trying to do. So trying to bring it together, put a process in place in terms of where you pick them up, so the different pick-up points, and then looking at, say, okay, what is mandatory in terms of how should we be sharing that information really timely, really dynamically, and then if they are going to be categorised as CCE, that there's a consistency across all the agencies, and then what's needed on the back of it. So hence it's a bit process, it's a bit trying to agree it, but hopefully that will be, it'll force us to do certain things once that label has been applied.
I'm on page 61. Have I gone too far ahead?
No.
On page 61, when I read this, I felt uncomfortable. And the reason that I felt uncomfortable is to be found probably halfway down. This means that when they are released from police custody, children and other vulnerable people often don't have ready access to the support services they may need. We heard evidence of, and then there are 4 bullet points, Chair. I think that having read that as the lead member for children and families for the County Council, I'm going to have to go back to my director and get information on each of those bullet points, which, if necessary, I may have to refer on to the safeguarding partnership as well, because I wouldn't like to think that we've got a problem in the county in terms of the 4 descriptors that are on that page.
Thanks very much, Ivan. Andrew?
Yeah, it was just point on page 64 about the children being excluded or at heightened risk, and the police not being informed. Is there a system in place for schools to inform the police of when they exclude children. So, sorry, is there a system in place for children, for schools to inform the police when children are excluded, or is there any plans for anything?
Those who know better say no. We are working, it's worth just mentioning, we are working quite closely with the West Midlands OPCC in terms of trying to find some kind of way through what is clearly, as this sets out, the problem that particularly relates to excluded children. I think there are all sorts of issues around here. Maybe the governance of schools may be one of them too, to be honest. But I'm not. It's not for today. But I think the answer to your question is no. Kirk, you probably know better than me.
I don't believe there is a role, or I don't believe there's a system that exists where schools report into police to say that young people have been excluded or off-rolled, or whichever way you say it, and the police hold a list of names across LLR that may have 600 people on it. I don't think it exists. I don't think it's ever existed. Should it? Very good question. Again, something I believe the CCE team should be looking at, because they are one of the most active cohorts of young people in the criminal justice system because of the additional risk that they pose because they're not in full-time education of any sort. So another challenging area for us to pick up. But again, there's the national picture and what that looks like and their policy and definitions against what we'd like to do here at a local level.
Any supplementary, Andrew? Okay. Kevin?
I don't know. What might help is that in Wixton there's the South Leicestershire Exclusion Partnership operating, where, having chaired the disciplinary committee for an academy for many years, they can be signposted to them. For the very first time, I took our commander to that centre to introduce them, to say, this is the police, this is what you do, this is what we do, because some of the young people attending that are some of the young people that are causing problems outside. So it was good to put them together so they can share information with regards to who they are. They're aware of the South Leicestershire Partnership now. They quite welcome the link between the two. So that partnership is now developing as we speak, and we're also getting them young people involved in the community to do projects that will help them in the future.
And that's in Wixton.
Something that you probably want to consider finding out about, whether South Leicestershire is deal with Inkley and Wixton and so on, but there's another one doing the other area somewhere else. I don't know where that is, but Ivan might.
And clarify that there are 5 inclusion partnerships that cover the entire county. But what I've just heard from Kevin is, I think, a really constructive suggestion to put forward to the chairs of those panels.
Yes. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Ivan. Getting back to the thematic report, any other questions or clarification points? Keith.
Sorry, at the foot of page 48 and top of page 49, where these 10 forces, they've compiled the spreadsheet called the County Collection Intelligence Collection Matrix. I was just amazed at the top of page 49. This is a laborious but necessary manual process. And, you know, when we're fighting sort of county lines, which they use these burner phones, which they dispose of, I know that's mentioned elsewhere, but I just thought, I don't know whether it's operational or strategic or cuts through both, but surely we as a force and with other forces ought to be buying computer systems that can talk to each other as we look ahead. So it's an observation as much as a question.
I absolutely agree. I mean, one of the things that we did a few years ago was to go into a 5-force around our niche platform so that we could start to share information across the crime and intelligence. But if I was to say to you, there's a whole programme of work now that we are linked in with our MSU colleagues around doing all of this type of thing, because we need to firstly capture the data, but then use AI to interrogate it and give us information. And we're starting to do that both for organised crime, but also for anti-corruption.
Okay, anything else, Debbie?
Just a request for Lord Back, please, on page 69 about the telecommunications. I mean, obviously the county lines, as soon as one shut down, then an hour later there's a new burner phone brought up, and so I'm just wondering if you can push that through a bit more for us, because wait until December for that legislation to come through. That seems to me one of the main things that we need to be trying to push through to stop these county lines from setting up again once they're shut down.
Thank you very much, Chair. This is, I think, quite an exciting paper because part of my job, as I've discovered over the last 4 years, of course, is holding the police to account. That's the main job, so they're an effective and efficient force. That's exciting enough, but actually what is really thrilling is trying to do work around the prevention area, which is I call the crime commissioner part of the job. I do sort of separate those two out, although there isn't a strict distinction. And here, I think, is setting before the panel what we've tried to do over the last number of years. I'm sure there are examples in here that won't be particularly successful. I'm equally sure there are examples here that will, in the end, turn out to be successful. Outcomes are very hard to judge in this particular area, but I hope that each of the ones that you see on the appendix demonstrate an attempt, at least, to try and find something that will deal, often through charities, third parties, third sectors, private companies too, that will do something to try and alleviate the position. Very concerned that it should affect not just classic young teenagers or early 20s, but should go back to early years, and also further on assist people of mature years too to feel secure and prevent crime. Now, I'm very grateful to Simon Down, my head of strategy and commissioning, who prepared this paper and of course can speak to it. And he and I will be happy, and others will be happy to answer any questions. So with your permission, Chair, pass on to Simon.
Over to you, Simon.
Thank you. So I trust that people have had opportunity to have a read of this, so I won't cover absolutely everything in the minute detail. I guess the best place to start is around the budget. So obviously you can see under 3 there that the commissioning budget is 4.3 million, and that's split against vulnerability, victims, prevention and cross-cutting issues, as it's set out there. In addition to that, that commissioning budget, there are also restricted short-term funding that we get from the Home Office. So there's the Violence Against Women and Girls Transformation Funding, which is 332,000 for this year, and then the Early Intervention Youth Fund, which is 347,000, and then the funding for the Violence Reduction Unit, or Network as we've called it locally, which is 880,000. So in total we've had 5.87 million this year to invest across LLR, which has been fantastic. In terms of the measurement of impact then, essentially our top priority there is doing that on a per contract basis. Clearly we want to make sure that each contract that we have, that is performing and delivering what we expect of it. And so we choose measures that are very much driven by both the police and crime plan and also wider drivers such as the Ministry of Justice. So they give some of that 4.3 million they give to us to make use of. And so we'll have to have measures around victim safety or how services might help victims to cope and recover. It's probably worth saying something around quality assurance as well. So with it, for our contracts, we always make sure we want to be measuring the impacts and ensuring that for any given point in time that they're delivering well, but we also want to make sure that they're going to be able to deliver well into the future, and that's where the quality assurance processes come in. So at this point that we're setting up a contract, we'll look to understand a variety of factors such as sourcing complexity, what the contract value is, how much that contract value represents to the organisation. Is it 60% of their income? And what the impact of service failure might be. And that will help us to work out what is the approach that we want to take to quality assurance for the contract. And then some of those measures, once we're in that within the contract delivery, might be safeguarding processes, looking at information governance processes, supply chain resilience, fraud prevention, to name a few. So that hopefully gives you a bit of a sense of our quality assurance and how we're measuring performance. The paper does then go into some further detail around some of our more significant services and sets out some of the achievements that have been had there. I won't go through those individually, but happy to take questions there. But I think in the round, what they do show is that a lot of what we do and fund is actually done in partnership with local authorities and other statutory organisations. And that applies to the Substance Misuse Treatment Service, the Sexual Violence Domestic Abuse, the Integrated Offender Management, to name but a few. I think the last thing to mention before going on to questions is just to say some of the things that we're looking to develop over the coming months. Obviously, we're always seeking to improve what we do, and we've worked with the community safety partnerships, and particularly it was agreed at the CSP Chairs Network recently that we would be having new monitoring arrangements for the for CSPs, and we expect that will help us to improve reporting across CSPs and to get, rather than just having a view of each CSP of what they're doing, be able to perhaps report against what's happening across the piece for those. We'll also be looking to have shared outcome measures across the new sexual violence and domestic abuse services that we're currently co-commissioning with our upper tier and unitary authorities. And that will be from April 21. And then finally, we will be developing improved reporting methodologies and capabilities across our contracts. So whilst it's really important for us to be able to see on a per contract basis how well performance is happening, so that we can manage that contract and help improve performance if it's not what we would like it to be, it's also important from a transparency perspective that we're able to give a more general report, and that's something that we want to grow into, our ability to do that, so that we can be even more transparent. I think that's all I've got to say, so open to any questions.
Sorry, Ewan. Page 75, the background, paragraph 3. Kevin?
Yeah, so only from the commissioning budget point of view, if I may, and talk about, there's a commissioning budget. Is there a client budget? How much does the client cost, or is it included in the commissioning group?
So I'm not sure exactly what you mean by client there. Can you able to just clarify that? Sorry, Kevin.
Together, who makes the contract? Who monitors that contract? Does that make sense? So how much does that cost? Is it shown within the commissioning group, or is it a separate cost altogether? And do you monitor it? And do we get the information regarding to that?
So yeah, that's an office cost, and is shown separately within the budget paper that came previously. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, yeah. So there's a small commissioning team within the OPCC. So there's myself, there's a commissioning manager who's Liz McDermott, and then there's a commissioning and contracts officer underneath that as well.
Do you then offset that cost against the individual commissioning work? Or is it a core funding that's not accounted for within the commissioning budget?
You saw it in the budget when we came last time, it's in there.
It's in the budget last time under office costs, because it includes the salary of those who work in that area of work in the office.
Yeah, I've seen that, but it doesn't tell me what is proportionate to each commissioning, to each contractor, if you like. That's the bit, because otherwise it's 1 million for that contractor, but put your cost to it, it actually puts the cost up, because you have to levy it somewhere, which is what accounting used to do in the past.
So just to be clear, all that 4.3 million goes to external providers. We don't use any of that for our internal costs. That's funded separately.
Just to clarify that, so that's 100% on cost to the contract. That's what I'm saying. You can't. You've got to keep them in perspective and say, well, I'm monitoring that contract, so many hours are going to that contract, so it's going to cost this. But it's not offset against the commissioning work, but it's the core funding on cost, which you can't draw back on.
Over to page 76, and we come to current impact measurement. At the bottom of the page, victim first. Les.
It's actually top of 77, but it's in the same section.
Yeah.
It's just idle curiosity. So, clearly, Lord Bart, your team have been doing a lot. What I'm really curious about is, on those set of bullet points, this is an intervention programme. So if we pick one out, 43% had no drug, alcohol or other harmful behaviour needs. So that's great. So, if you took on 100 service users, 43 came out of the other end okay. What happens to the other 57?
These are victims of crime. These are victims of crime for whom Victim First exists. So they've already been the victims of crime, and it's for them, Victim First, to look after, if they want to, and each of them give them the opportunity to use Victim First in order to make life easier, as it were, between that time and when the case is finished. So this is just an analysis of the people who have sought the help of Victim First, having been victims of crime to begin with. Does that make sense? There's no 57%, or 57% of them have no drug, alcohol or harmful behaviour.
Just to be clear, so this is, so for Victim First, there were a cohort, so they undertake the needs assessment. There was a cohort that had some drug, alcohol or harmful behaviour needs, and by the end of their engagement with Victim First, 43% of those had no. Now, obviously, I didn't want to go into huge reams of detail, so there will be some that had it reduced, and there'll be some that didn't. Only a very small percentage that would be. It was largely successful. Clearly, with long-term, issues that take a long period of time to resolve, you're not, and a service such as Victim First, which is around the victimisation element, you're not necessarily going to expect to see those specific issues completely dealt with. What we would expect to be seeing is obviously some reduction, and that they're referring them onto those specialist services that will be able to help them with those issues to hopefully a completion.
That was the answer. They get referred on to another specialised service. Thank you.
That satisfied your curiosity.
Absolutely.
Could I use Les's question just to say that tomorrow we're going to celebrate Victim First winning an award, a national award, I believe. Yes. A national award for the work that they do, which we're obviously all very pleased about.
Very good.
Good news. Good news. Thank you very much. Oh, Ivan, whereabouts are you on this?
77.
Yep.
Really following on from what Les has already raised, can I first of all thank the PCC for the report? I thought the report was really informative, and certainly on UAVA is an area that he and I have discussed together in the past. It was really good to see both quantitative and qualitative information, because not everything can be put into an easy figurative outcome assessment that would give you an A, B, C or D. Like Les, though, I would feel that I would like to be reassured that if 21% of a cohort haven't got any education and employment needs, I read that as 79% still have, and I'd like to know really how Victim First ensure that those needs get met. And in saying that, Chair, I'm very conscious that some years ago, Paul, when he was on the probation service and I was a member of the probation board, were given the issue of people who were in the probation service who had poor educational skills, which seemed to be fairly commonplace amongst a lot of the people who were repeat offenders. So happy to have that reassurance. Would like to thank you for the report. I found it really interesting, really illuminative. Very conscious, Lord Bark, that you're not going to be the Police and Crime Commissioner, which therefore raises for me an issue of continuity. I thought this was all very positive, Chair. I'd like to think that whoever the incumbent is after May will be prepared to continue with these lines.
I'd like to thank Ivan for that comment. I hope so too. And that's why I'm working up until my last day to make sure that whoever is lucky or unlucky enough to succeed me has of course all the power he or she needs, but not everything.
The one comfort got, we've still got the same chief executive and the same officers.
Did you say comfort, Chair?
No.
So I thought, yes, quite right here.
I think so.
Yeah.
So still the same members of staff below the chief executive. So that will give some consistency. But of course, the guy at the top, whoever gets elected, that person will be able to change direction. But who knows? We won't predict what's going to happen there. Still on page 77, substance misuse treatment service. Bit below, sexual violence and domestic abuse helpline information service.
Chair, could I just say a word about the substance misuse treatment service? This is personal, really. I think they do an absolutely phenomenal job. I have to say, so I shouldn't be so forward about it, but I'm really impressed by the way in which this contract has been done, and those who sort of work off this contract too. And I don't, in many ways, I don't think there's any more fundamental work than these people do, because I think we underrate just how much crime is down to substance misuse, and within that, we underrate how much is down to alcohol misuse, which I think is something that's sort of unsaid, but is there all the time.
Thank you very much, Lord Bark. Still page 77, sexual violence, domestic abuse helpline. Over the page, 78, integrated offender management, prevention fund.
Say a word about that, Chair,
Of
because
course.
that's the appendix. It's the second appendix. This is called Prevention Fund. I suppose it's a good title for it. So, and small grants talks about 25,000 maximum. We don't. It's never 20. It's not really ever 25,000. 10,000 is what we're looking for, really, as a maximum for it. Maybe 10,000 over 2 years. But if you look at that appendix, and you will see, and I'm sure members have, you will see, I hope, a variety of organisations that have gained by it, and I hope pretty varied as well. But I'm really very much hope, Ivan's really led me on to say this, that my successor does keep this small grants fund or prevention fund going, because I think it can be quite valuable.
Thank you. Just about the introducing the new community safety partnership monitoring, the form on the Appendix D there. Obviously in our own CSPs we get put together with our own family group. Is there any way we can look at what all the other CSPs are doing within Leicestershire? Because we can't compare how we're doing or share good practice between the CSPs because we don't know what they're doing or what results they're getting. So it would be useful, I think, to share what's happening in all the CSPs and their data, if possible.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, absolutely, yes. And I guess that's partly the why we want to have a consistent approach is so that we can have comparative statistics between the CSPs, so that we can have that understanding and see where there must be areas of good practice there. Let's see if one CSP can learn from another.
Can you share that with us though as well, rather than you seeing it in the office? We need to see that down on the localities in our CSPs.
Could I just add to that we had the session in Melton where Lizzie and her team were presenting the dashboard, I mean, the other thing I've assumed from that, it might be worth just checking, that the dashboard for Charnwood and Leicester and wherever will be available to everywhere else, you know, so they will be, you know, so you will have that comparative data. I've got that right, Liz, yeah, okay. So you'll have that as well.
I understand Melt went well, by the way. So I'm told.
Worried that we were offering too much, but there we are.
And we are holding you to it.
Yeah.
Can I just say that having the time to go through Power BI for all the other CSPs is quite onerous for us as CSPs really, and having the officer staff to do that. So if you're going to do some overarching analysis, it would be easy if you just share that, because we won't have time to go into everyone else's dashboards.
Yeah, I'm getting a nod there. I mean, but Lizzie always nods. So, but yeah, I think that I know what you mean. Yeah, you can't dive into it, but if you have a kind of like a dashboard of the whole thing, yeah, I think we can do that. Yeah.
Lizzie certainly knows what you mean. You're okay. Les.
I thought that was the ambition, that we just had commonality through the PCC's office and through Lizzie, that we just have a common dashboard for the CSPs across the LLR.
Yeah, no, I think what Deborah was saying is rather than dive into everyone's individual analysis, we have a kind of a sort of top level summary. I think that's what, yeah.
Okay, members. Moving on to appendix. We'll go page by page, but we'll be quick if you've got any clarification needed. 80, this is appendix A, of course. 81, 82, 83, 84 and 85. Appendix B, 86, 7, 8, 9, 90, 91, 92. Which one?
Just a quick overview, just to say that looking through there, it's good to see that it's across the board in LLR and the difference in the grants and things that's been done across the board. So I just really want to say thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. 93. Appendix C, slightly different. Anything on page 94 and 95 and 96 on the back there. Nothing. Okay, members, thanks very much. I enjoyed that report and some good stuff in there. So thank you very much. Members, I ask you to note the report. Thank you very much. Moving on to the next item on the agenda, 8, Deputy PCC update. Lord Bark, do you want to introduce this?
Straight on to the Deputy PCC.
Thank you, Chair. I'll just go through some of the highlights of my working in the OPCC's office under Lord Willie Back. So obviously my main task is to promote the role of the office and the Police and Crime Commissioner and the Police and Crime Plan around the 5 Vs and the prevention works that we do. Some particulars around some of the programmes and projects that I look at is serious organised crime, along with the Deputy Chief Constable Rob Nixon. I sit on the Serious Organised Crime Board, and I'm pleased to say they do some good stuff on there. I'm quite convinced where they're going with this is having an impact across LLR, and especially in this really important area. We try and add the strategic bits of that, bits around what Deborah spoke about, the community impacts and the wider issues relating to families and other young people that organised crime groups impact on. Then there's obviously the day-to-day stuff around the budget and the precept consultation and the alignments, working alongside our new violence reduction unit to make sure that all coincides with our grants and commissioning process, and also the serious organised crime stuff and the surge money that the police had to look at it in the round so there's no gaps or grey areas. Looking alongside the Positive Action Gold Group around recruitment, retention and progression. Some of you may have heard of the stats, the police force in the next, I don't know, what was it, 50% change in the next 4 years?
Yeah,
is that right?
I mean, we've done some workforce modelling, and we think between 42 and 50% of the current officers in Leicestershire will either retire or move on within the next, which is significant change.
Significant.
Yeah.
So we've been looking at that with the Positive Action team, and the chair of that board is the Chief Constable, who's taking this really seriously around looking at the opportunities to increase the BAME percentage within the police force, which is just under 10% now, but should be up near 24% across LLR. So that's a really keen programme that Willie's heavily involved in as well. I also coordinate and chair a new programme which is called the Ex-Offenders Steering Group, which is looking at having one platform across LLR. Some of the partners across this room are involved in that, where ex-offenders will seek opportunities for employment, and where we can host a range of businesses and companies across LLR that will create opportunities for ex-offenders, so they're aware of they're going to provide those opportunities, and we will put the support in place for businesses where grants may be needed, additional training may be needed, some financial support if necessary, but also get ex-offenders work ready, because not all of them are ready for work when they're released from custody or from the sentences that they've been serving. Also working with West Mids quite closely on a joint initiative which the senior police team have been involved in, again around serious violence and knife crime. The ongoing, the OPC's LLR engagement sessions, the What Matters for You, the VCS groups, meetings, the grants and the projects and the patchworks. Where are we? Working with the CART, I also chair the senior management team within the OPCC's office, and the list of meetings that I attend is the APCC's national meeting, the SOC board. I work very closely with the support networks across policing, the gold that I mentioned around positive action, the chief officer team meeting, our strategic assurance board meeting, strategic partnership board meeting, and the exec. I chair the youth out of court disposals panel, along with the regional and national meetings, Crime Stoppers, amongst other things. And I'll leave it there, Chair, and I'm happy to take any questions for anything that I've missed, unless you want me to go into next week's diary.
Thanks very much, Kirk. Obviously, under Lord Bark, you're coming to the finish, so and we won't. Well, we're supposed to have got another meeting, haven't we? We've got one in March, so we could always look back over the past 4 weeks. So next week won't be necessary, just at this moment in time. But we just might come back on it. Are there any questions? I'm looking round. You've certainly been a busy guy, anyway, Kirk. Yeah. So congratulations to you for cramming it all in. So absolutely nothing for Kirk whatsoever. Okay, thank you very much, and thank you, Lord Bark, for allowing Kirk to do all that work. Obviously, like I say, you'd have been lost without him, really. Yeah.
I don't like saying it in front of him, but I would have been completely lost without him. I don't know if you mentioned knife crime.
Oh,
I have asked Kirk to also look at, just to add to his small number of other responsibilities.
I was waiting for him to mention
leading on knife crime. I know he's doing a lot of work for the City Council on that, so it does seem quite a good fit actually too, and that's an important piece of work as well.
I was listening for knife crime, but you didn't mention it. Would you just like to expand on the work you're doing actually with this? Only in headlines, obviously.
I think the knife crime work, obviously there's a lot of surge operations and police operations that are going on around serious violence and knife crime. The Home Office has identified LLR as one of the top 18 areas and given us £880,000 to set up a VRN. All of our areas, County, Rutland and the City, are doing work around this through our CSPs. And I think it's about making sure that we're all on the same page and we know where we're going with this, and we're not overlapping the resources that we're spending, and we're spending money in the right areas. We're getting the data sets together and there's no overlap and replication of work where it's unnecessary. So it's just getting a global picture of that. I'm hoping through the OPCC's office and the VRN that at some point they will be the kind of hub that will lead on all of this across LLR. That's the objective for their existence, to make sure that we focus on the right people, families and places across LLR that need the relevant support, and we just need to tie this up. Me and Rob have been speaking about this for a while now. We're doing a bit of a deep dive between both of our offices in the next couple of weeks to see what they're doing, see what we're doing, and then we'll spread that out through the VRN across LLR more widely. So we just don't want to waste the resource that we've got, because we don't know how long we've got it for, and we need to make maximum impact from it to reduce what's going on externally.
Sounds good work. Well done. Okay, members, moving on to the last item on the agenda, which is data next meeting, 26th of March, 2 p.m. at City Hall, Leicester. I I haven't got any further items to bring before you other than say safe trip home and thank you very much. And Les, you're an hour early.